Good afternoon, everyone. I see people are just logging on, so we'll give everyone maybe 30 seconds as they join. I just wanted to say welcome and thank you for joining us. And give us maybe 30 more seconds and we'll jump right into today's webinar. All right, thank you guys for joining us for today's webinar on building resilient food systems across the prairies. My name's Cameron Hunter, and I'm a project manager at the International Institute for Sustainable Development. IISD acts as the secretariat for the PRAC. For those of you who haven't heard of it, the PRAC is a cost-shared program between the governments of Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and Natural Resources Canada that aims to increase the capacity of government and civil society decision makers on the prairies to understand, prepare for, and take action to address the implications of our changing climate. Today's webinar is the second in a series of 4 webinars to be hosted by the PRAC. Each of these sessions will explore topics relevant to the theme of building resilience of communities to the multiple shocks and stresses, including those associated with climate change. During our first session 2 weeks ago on building climate resilient communities, we heard about the importance of proactive adaptation planning and the need to engage stakeholders in this planning. We had the opportunity to hear from 2 case studies on building back better after being faced with an extreme climate event. Through these case studies, the panelists emphasized the importance of building trust and social connections with partners and community members prior to the anticipated climate impact, delivering information in a culturally appropriate manner, and learning from the experiences of others. To view this recording and to learn more about our future webinars in the series, please visit the Prairies RAC website, prairiesrac.com. While today's event is being held virtually, I'd like to acknowledge you that I'm currently in Winnipeg, which is located in Treaty 1 territory, the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. So, without further ado, I'd like to turn over today's webinar to our moderator, Beth Timmers, who is a project manager at IISD. Beth?
Thank you so much, Cameron, and thank you so much to our guest speakers and everybody who's in attendance today. I'm broadcasting in from Winnipeg, where it is absolutely freezing, so I hope you're all taking care at home. I hope that today's event is going to help provide some concrete understanding to how we can support our food systems to both cope and thrive in the current environment in which we find ourselves. So last month, Natural Resources Canada released the Prairie Provinces chapter of Canada in a Changing Climate, the Regional Perspectives Report. This report is a synthesis of our knowledge of climate change impacts and adaptation across our prairie provinces and includes insights that relate to our food system. I'm going to go through some of those now specifically. According to the report, while prairie agriculture might benefit from higher temperatures and a longer growing season, achieving those net benefits is going to require, just lost my spot here, is going to require a lot of adaptation to limit the impacts of climate extremes, including on water availability, and the increased risk of pests, vector-borne diseases, and invasive species. Climate change is also expected to have impacts on other elements of our food system, from production all the way to consumption. The report altogether analyzes how the impacts of climate change may exacerbate existing societal inequities, which also has implications for people's ability to access food. Public policy and adaptation planning should consider the unique challenges people face accessing nutritious food that they prefer, and also the means by which race, age, gender, and poverty amplify vulnerability and resilience to food-related climate hazards. So across the food system, by building resilience into how we grow, distribute, and access food can help limit the potential impacts of climate change. Now, to start things off, I want to interact a little bit with the audience just to get a sense of where you're coming from today. So like our last webinar, I want to invite everybody to go to menti.com. You're going to see it come up on the screen here. You can access this on your smartphone or web browser, and there's going to be a 6-digit code coming up on the screen there. So first, this is a really easy question. I just want to get a sense of who is joining us today. I'll just give you a few minutes to fill that out. All right, so we have lots of representation from the prairies and even some people attending from Ontario, Quebec, BC. It's great to see this equal representation from across the prairies because of the way that the PRAC is set up. That's awesome. All right, so next, this is a bit of a harder question. We just want to get a sense of where the audience is coming from regarding your perspectives on resilient food systems. And we'd like you to just add a few words. We're going to make a word cloud just to understand where you're coming from on this issue. All right, so equity is coming up strong in the middle here. A lot of interest in the local aspect of food systems and also that societal aspect. I see several people have addressed sustainability, lots of the different components of our definition of food security. All right, this is great. Thank you so much for all your responses here. All right, wonderful. Great to have some interaction from the audience. I know we have a lot of people in the audience today, about 140 people, so that's wonderful. So next we're going to move on to our panelist presentations. Today we're going to begin by hearing from Susanna Klassen, who is a PhD candidate in the Institute for Resources, Environment and Sustainability at UBC, and she's also Vice Chair of Food Secure Canada. Susanna studies the local dimensions of food system transformations, including organic certification, agroecological diversification, and labor. Susanna is going to provide us with some background and understanding of resilient food systems as a concept. Then we're going to move into our panelist presentations, who are going to share their experiences with building resilient food systems before engaging everybody in a moderated discussion. And that's where the audience comes back in. We'll answer some of your questions. So please, throughout the event, type your questions into the Q&A panel and feel free to direct your questions to a specific panelist. If you don't, we'll try to assess who's best to answer. And we know that this is such an engaging audience. We know there's a lot of people here today, so we'll try our best to get to every question. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to our first speaker, Susanna.
Hi, can you hear me okay? Hopefully, yes. Thanks, Beth. So thank you so much for that kind introduction, Beth, and thank you for inviting me to give this presentation alongside such amazing panelists. And I've really enjoyed preparing for it, and I'm really looking forward to hearing from the other panelists and the discussion to follow. So as I begin, I'd like to acknowledge that my work is situated on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam people. And I'm very grateful to be able to be a guest on these lands where I work out of the University of British Columbia. So as Beth said, I was asked to give a sort of definitional overview of the resilience concept. So what I'm going to try to do with our short time is to pull out what I think are some of the key insights and ways of thinking about resilience relative to food systems and climate change from what is now a fairly expansive and rich literature on resilience thinking. And just before we begin, or as we begin, resilience as a word, like sustainability as a concept, has become very widely used, especially in the last decade. And some people assert that those words have even lost meaning. But a lot of this discourse and questioning the meaning of these concepts, what comes along with that is some really valuable critique of the concepts and evolution in our way of thinking about them, which I think is really valuable. So hopefully today I can sort of help clear the air a little bit around the concept of resilience. Next slide, please. So to get us started, let's begin with one of the more recent definitions of resilience, and that is the capacity of a system to experience shocks while retaining essentially the same function, structure, feedbacks, and therefore identity. So keywords there are certainly shocks, experiencing shocks, and the ability to retain identity. And another way of putting it is that resilience thinking provides a model for increasing society's capacity to manage change. And of course, that is why it's so relevant to our discussions and work around climate change. And another way that the concept of resilience is being used a lot today is actually in terms of an individual's psychological health. And that's another really important discourse, but not one that we're covering today. But broadly speaking, in this discourse, folks talk about the ability and the capacity to bounce back. And I think that that idea of bouncing back is something familiar to a lot of us, and so can also be used to think about resilience. Next slide, please. So this graphic is from an important piece of work from 1973 by Crawford Stanley Halling, or Buzz Halling, where he actually introduced the concept of resilience. And in this really seminal publication, Halling described the notion of resilience as it was being applied to ecology, which is where it originated, as the amount of disturbance a system can absorb without shifting into an alternate regime. And so just to explain the image in case it can be helpful to anyone, we can think about the trough on the left as maybe being a desirable state, and you can see that a disturbance would cause the balls rolling around in that trough to move around. And if they were disturbed sufficiently, they might go all the way up and over the threshold in the middle, moving into a new regime on the right. So just again, a useful way of thinking about how disturbances can change the identity of a system. And the definition and theory around this concept has really evolved considerably since it was introduced in the 70s. And I'm thankfully not going to walk you through this, but I do think that this figure represents useful imagery when trying to think through what resilience means. And then finally, I just want to mention, because I didn't know this, but Buzz Halling is actually a Canadian scientist, and was this seminal work in the 70s was done while he was at the University of British Columbia. I thought that was interesting. Next slide, please. So as part of defining resilience, I also wanted to touch on how resilience relates to some other key terms or concepts that all of you are likely familiar with, which are adaptation and vulnerability, because they are really closely related terms. So adaptability can be defined as the capacity of actors to influence or manage resilience. So the other way of thinking about that is resilience is the outcome of increasing adaptive capacity. And finally, vulnerability or fragility are sort of opposites to resilience. And now there is some considerable discussion in the literature on this last piece of vulnerability being the opposite of resilience. And part of that stems from the fact that resilience was developed as a concept mostly stemming from ecology, and vulnerability stems more from social theory. So we don't need to get into that, but I do think that this is a general way of thinking about these terms relative to one another that may be helpful. Next slide, please. So in an effort to get a little more into a little more tangible application of the resilience concept, I wanted to bring in some of the significant amount of academic work that translates theory of resilience to agroecosystems or farming systems, which is obviously relevant for us today. And many of you are much more experienced at this than I am probably. But it's really important to mention here before I just go through the specifics, that these ways of thinking and managing agroecosystems have really been informed by indigenous approaches to food cultivation, as well as agroecology and global peasant movements. And it was nice to see some of those concepts and groups being represented in the word cloud at the beginning. And so, and there are also really important links with conservation agriculture, no-till farming, and the organic movement. But resilience in terms of agroecosystems really stems from diversity. So these are just a few examples of some approaches and practices that have been shown to build resilience of the agroecosystem to climate-related shocks. And those include enhancing field and farm scale biodiversity through complex crop rotations, cover cropping, intercropping, and agroforestry, which also increase below ground diversity and soil food web complexity. And then also ecological approaches to managing soil fertility, like reintegrating livestock intercropping systems, adding organic nutrient sources like animal and green manures, and just generally building up soil organic matter. Next slide, please. Building food system resilience, however, requires more than just ecological or techno-specific knowledge, of course. We cannot separate the natural systems involved in food production from socioeconomic systems in which natural systems are embedded, if you care to think about it like that. So I chose these two photos to sort of illustrate some of the reverberations of different kinds of shocks that we've experienced that have greatly affected the food system. And the top is from, of course, the global food price riots of 2011 caused by an economic shock, and some of you are probably familiar with this photo. And the bottom is of folks lining up outside a Costco in Quebec during the first wave of the COVID pandemic, where a virus suddenly impacted purchasing, eating, distribution, and labor patterns of food in a very short period of time. So food systems are very much complex social ecological systems. And this changes everything, of course, when you take into account the social dimensions and economic dimensions and political dimensions. Some important characteristics or traits of complex systems that have come out of complex systems thinking and literature relating to resilience are ideas of multi-causality, which is when any given pattern may actually be caused by several different processes. The idea of cumulative impacts, where processes don't just operate separately, but they interact and accumulate to produce an outcome. Non-linearity, where social and ecological patterns do not gradually change as a linear function, but display things like thresholds, time lags, and just generally complex nonlinear behavior. And then this is another really interesting idea of teleconnections. And that's the idea that in a really highly connected world, which is what we live in, patterns in one location can actually result from processes and events in what may feel like or be a geographically distant location. And so because of all these layers of complexity, I don't want you to get too caught up in them, but I think they're fascinating. There is the argument from some scholars that detailed models of resilience really may not be possible, and that identifying more general rules of thumb may be more helpful in guiding action by farmers, communities, and governments towards resilience. Next slide, please. So there is a very important question that I'm sure all of you already ask, which is the resilience of what to what? And that is discussed a lot in the more recent literature around resilience in social ecological systems. And so just to start by honing in on that first part, resilience of what? So what or which systems do we want to be resilient? And I think here, asking the right questions, the right kinds of questions is really the most important part at arriving at answers or solutions. And so I've just tried to share a few questions here that maybe you already ask in your work or that you could ask more, which is, well, to start, we touched briefly on farming systems. So what do we already know about what makes a resilient farming system, and how can we better apply that knowledge to food systems? But it's also important to look at things from the other valence and more broadly about food systems. So what creates vulnerability to shocks in other aspects of the food system in the first place? What are the systems, or what aspects of systems do we want to maintain? Or put differently, what do we want from our systems? And also, where are they falling short? Next slide, please. So that leads me to one of the most important critiques of the resilience concept. And so this is one key part of the discourse that I think I wanted to share with you, is that sometimes it's unhelpful when we're talking about systems that need to be transformed. So resilience doesn't do always a very good job of addressing equity and justice concerns, which really need to be at the center of how we respond to climate change, clearly. So while we often talk about resilience in a really positive sense, in an academic sense, resilience is actually meant to be a neutral concept. And this is because sometimes undesirable states can actually be very resilient. And a great example of this that is used often is poverty. And so, then of course, that's very closely related to food insecurity. And this is just a figure from Proof. If you're not familiar with the Proof project out of University of Toronto, you should definitely take a gander. But we have persistently high rates of poverty and food insecurity in Canada. And so going back to those questions from the previous slide, it really is important to interrogate the way that systems are currently working, who currently wins and loses, and how that may need to change, rather than just assuming that the way that the system is working is good and we need to just maintain it. Next slide, please. So just coming back to this question of resilience of what to what, for the second part, it's of course very helpful to look at the particular context in which you're trying to build resilience. So looking at the projected regional impacts of climate change in the report chapter on the prairie provinces that Beth was summarizing is very key, and thinking about other context-specific ways that climate change or other shocks that could result from it, or things like global pandemics, would impact a particular part of the food system. Next slide, please. So in an effort towards giving you guys some rules of thumb, and I don't know, again, I feel that many of you in the audience and certainly the panelists probably know this better than I do, but to give the conceptual piece, I think these are some important causes and characteristics, causes of vulnerability and characteristics of resilience that I felt are worth sharing. And a lot of these have really been highlighted by the recent pandemic. And so perhaps a silver lining of the COVID-19 crisis has been our very sharpened thinking about the ways that our food system is vulnerable, and what we need to do to address those vulnerabilities. So just some characteristics of vulnerability are caused by consolidation and concentration in the food system, being hyper-specialized instead of being diversified. Systemic inequities are certainly one of the key causes of and most immediate barrier to resilience, and uniformity is again the opposite of diversity. And so resilience, what it can look like is having rights and supports and access to resources, the autonomy and control of local actors. This is really from the ecological ecology, but it is also applicable to social systems, which is functional and response diversity. So filling different niches in the way that a system operates, but also having a diversity of ways that a system or actors or pieces of a system might respond to a disturbance. And then finally, the idea of redundancy, which is really, it seems counterintuitive, but having redundancy in a system can build resilience, and it's also something that is usually eliminated when you're trying to increase efficiency. So that's just a trade-off to be really aware of. Next slide, please. So just trying to summarize a few key take-home messages. Resilience obviously really isn't about individuals, but about systems, communities, and institutions. The other piece is just this very interconnected nature of food systems and the natural and social interactions that create so much complexity, which we really need to embrace in our planning and thinking about how we want to address climate change. Equity is actually an important means of achieving resilience and achieving a desirable state that we want to be resilient. And then again, I think everyone is fairly aware of this, but that technology alone is really not going to be sufficient. And it's really important to think about governance processes, community capacities, access to and control over resources. And we can really take a cue from movements like the food sovereignty movement in relation to that. And then finally, just there's really such an important role for governments and institutions to play in providing these supports. And of course, that's why we're here in part. So thank you for that. Next slide, please. Just stay here for 1 minute, but as sort of a final imagery, I think it's easy when we're talking about climate change to really think about these acute impacts that it's going to cause, and of course flooding being a super major threat in the prairies, and then thinking about, okay, how do we address flooding? Well, we need to increase drainage, maybe we need some dikes, and other sort of equivalently acute responses. But next slide, please. Obviously, it's really important to also think about what the human role is, and I think resilience sometimes doesn't look like dikes or drainage, but actually just looks like people sitting around a table and practicing their food sovereignty. So I'm so excited to hear from the various case studies, as I think they'll really exemplify that for us. And that's it. Thank you so much.
All right, Susanna, thank you so much for an incredible introduction to these concepts surrounding resilient food systems. That was such an excellent presentation, wonderful imagery, and really gives us a good understanding of what a resilient food system really means. And those examples that you provided were really helpful. I also didn't realize that buzz hauling is Canadian, so thank you for that. So next, we're going to hear from people who will share their practical experiences working on food issues so they can withstand similar or even more severe events or shocks in the future. I'm going to give a brief introduction to each of our panelists and then ask them each to take the virtual floor, and we'll share their presentations. So we had slated first Carl McCorrister, but we're just experiencing technical difficulties there, so hopefully he can join us a bit later. But Carl is the garden coordinator for Peguis First Nation, and he's a retired high school teacher. He taught for 25 years, coached sports in the community. Now he's writing for the newspaper, growing his own food, and is also an advisor for the Northern Manitoba Food, Culture, and Community Collaborative. Next, but perhaps first, just due to these technical difficulties, we're going to hear from Lara Ellis, who's the Senior Vice President of Policy and Partnerships at Alternative Land Use Services, or as it's more commonly known, ALUS. Lara's work focuses on the development of new regulated and unregulated ecosystem service markets and growing support for natural infrastructure on agricultural lands. Then we're going to hear from Alanna Gray, who has worked at Keystone agricultural producers for about 10 years, over 10 years now. In her current position of policy manager, she's responsible for moving forward CAP policy developed through their grassroots democratic process with farmers, as well as coordinating multiple policy committees. So each panelist is going to give a short presentation, about 7 minutes or so, before we engage in a moderated discussion. Then we're going to open up questions from the audience, and I would like to encourage thoughtful engagement with both our keynote speaker and our panelists as we seek to learn more about how we can build resilience in our prairie food systems.
Hi, Beth. Sorry to interrupt. It's Cameron. Just to let you know that Carl's on the phone right now. Carl, thank you for joining us.
Okay, great. So we will then move right into Carl's presentation. Carl?
Yes, hi. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Can you hear me?
We can. Are you able to see your slides?
Yes, I can. I have them on my laptop, but I couldn't join the webinar on the like to be able to see all the pictures here. So I'm on my phone.
Okay, great.
So
well, we can hear you loud and clear, and we have your slides. So if you want to talk through your presentation, then we can roll with the punches and share your slides because they're really.
Yeah, so yeah, the slides can go up, up to the sign of Peguis. So I will introduce myself first of all. Just to say good afternoon, everyone. I'm happy to be here to be part of this webinar. And sounds very interesting for what I've caught up so far. My name is Carl McCorrister, and I'm a member of the Peguis First Nation here in Manitoba. We are in Treaty 1 territory. That treaty was signed in 1871, making it 150 years old this year in August. We were formerly of the St. Peter's Reserve, Selkirk, Manitoba, where we settled at the mouth of the Red River back in the 1700s. And we were there for almost a couple hundred years. And then settlement came along and we were forcibly removed by an illegal surrender in 1907. And historically, our people were agricultural, being one of the first to have a permanent settlement with agricultural roots. It goes deep. I've been raised by parents, grandparents that were farmers actually, so that's part of my history. For many years, our people had small farms, their own food systems, the land, and they were mainly independent, supporting their family with labor. And I just want to add here that our people are very resilient. I hear that word coming up. And I guess in terms of surviving on Turtle Island for thousands of years, and of course, that meant we had to have our own food security, which was there. It was there for thousands of years. And through time, colonization, the factor of this system, and residential school system, we lost our food security to modern living. We are now in the process of trying to regain it. A little about myself. I'm a former teacher, high school teacher here in Peguis. I taught for 25 years. I had my Bachelor of Education. Then I actually went back and got a graduate degree. Had 4 children, 7 grandchildren, all out there now. And this COVID has really separated us, not being able to visit. Our community garden started back 11 years ago. This, I think, will be our 12th year coming up. And I guess one of our things we wanted to do was to bring back food security in our communities. And maybe I'll just touch on our vision here. I know it's going to come up on the pictures, but just so that what I'm talking about. Our vision at that time, and it remains real to us, to regain our heritage and culture of community agriculture and having our community members grow their own food in the hope that their children will continue in the future. And that's where we're at today. We're continuing that after 11 years, and you know, it's still happening. We started out, like I mentioned, in 2008. We got 3 acres of land here from our council. We tilled it, and then we started planting. And this was done with no funding, by the way, for the first few years. And so we were just using volunteers and doing some of our own fundraising. So as we continued to have success with our vegetables, we got more people on board. Then as time rolled on, we were able to get funding and assistance, mostly by the Northern Collaborative. And from that time on, we've had a relationship with them continually. We got equipment for what we needed. And as time went on, a lot of people actually went on their own, meaning that they started having their own gardens working with us. And today, this past year, we've had 56 community members with their own gardens, and those numbers are continuing to grow. So if someone's got those slides there, you can put them up and just give me what you got there, and I'm looking at them on my laptop.
Absolutely, Carl. We're right now looking at the vision slide that you provided to us.
The Peguis one?
Yes.
Yeah, that sign there was made with that Rogers Hockey Night we hosted here last year, and that was prepared, and it became kind of famous across Hockey Night in Canada. That was kind of our signature for our community there, that big sign, yeah, and that's when it came here. And there's going to be a little bit of gardening done around it with flowers and so on, by the way. So it's right in front of our mall. Yep. Okay, go to the next one.
Yep.
The vision, it mentions there, and there's pictures. You can see our garden on top left. Some of the growth there, and I think it's around in the middle of July that our garden is there. And you'll see our vision on the left there also that I just shared. On the right, we have elders coming in once the harvest starts in the middle of the summer. We have days where we ask our elders to come in and we share our crop. And you'll see those potatoes are there, and potatoes are really very important to our people. It goes way back, and it's part of our diet and very important to us. On the left bottom, you'll see some young people planting. And that picture was taken in early May, and we had the land prepared, and this is when we start planting our crop, our vegetables. And so we had these young people come in. Some of them were actually from the ALCare Center in the ALCare program, and I think there were some from other communities, actually. I think we had about 15 of them show up. So, again, it was just part of, introducing our young people to going back to the land and growing our own food. Go to the next one.
All right, thanks.
Is that with purpose?
Yep.
Yeah, okay. The picture on the bottom, you'll see two elders. They were actually filling bags with vegetables there. And this was in Selkirk, Manitoba. We were harvesting our crop. We had an Elders Day here. And so after that, we had a request by people in Selkirk. And by the way, we have a lot of people there yet from our old reserve that never left Selkirk area. And these two people are two of them. And that their families remained in Selkirk area. So we went down with my truck there, a load of vegetables, and we shared with the elders there. And I think we had around 38 or something like that show up. So we shared our vegetables with them. On the right, you'll see that roots, that Seneca Roots, by the way. I don't know if anybody recognized them. We have a lot of Seneca Root in our area. I have lots right on my own land here. And of course, they're medicinal. They could be used for different types of medicine. But they're also a cash crop now. And it has a history of being shipped to other countries, the United States, that particular root. And it's used in pharmaceuticals. And I noticed in the last few years that it's getting more and more popular, and meaning the price goes up. So it benefits a lot of our people that are unemployed and can dig them, and it's really a good part of these young people that can get out there and dig. And this past year it was really good. Actually, it was a good crop of Seneca Root, so that's happening here also. Okay, next picture. Our future plans.
Yep.
Yeah, you'll see on the left, that's our garden arbor behind us there, where we bring people in, and we have some tables in there, and also a cook stove. So we do some cooking in there also, and sharing some of the fresh vegetables. That particular group was visitors also. They came in to visit. No, I just can't recall the group. But they came in just to visit us for the day, and we do have a lot of visitors. We get a lot of requests, and of course, this past year with the COVID, we couldn't do that. We couldn't bring people in and share. We were able to have one day for elders this past year, and that was it. We had to follow all the rules and protocols and so on. The middle picture is we were picking potatoes, and you can see someone operating a tractor, and the potatoes are that's a 70-year-old potato digger, by the way. And we were able to get it from an old friend and got it working, and it works great. So we pick our potatoes with that particular old machine there behind the tractor. On the right, you'll see it was an Elders Day, so you can see a group of people there, and that was in our arbor. They come, we have lunch, and like I said, we share our vegetables. Some of them want to go out and pick their own in the garden, so we do that with them also. And those days are quite important for our community, especially our elders. But they're always, you know, they come along with a grandchild or something too. So we do have young people coming in. And they share their stories, by the way. I think that's maybe what we were doing. Some of them, you know, recall their parents and having a garden. And so that knowledge is being passed on there. It's great to have this particular Elders Day and to have that sharing. And I think that's it for the there. But I just want to continue with a few other things. Besides our community garden, we have the you know, the regular season of growing vegetables, and we have other initiatives that we're working with other organizations. One of them is the University of Manitoba. 2 years ago, I was able to get in contact with the Faculty of Agriculture there at the university, and they knew what we were doing here through word of mouth and so on. And so Dr. Doug Cheney, I don't know if anybody's met him there, he's part of that University of Manitoba seed program, and they were having crops go out to try on small acreages. So we were able to get a perennial wheat. I think they referred to as kernza. And we prepared a 3-acre site here, and we grew this wheat for the university. And Dr. Doug was out to visit us, and he couldn't come, of course, at the end of the year last year because of the shutdown. But we were able to harvest that crop. And by the way, it's one of the characteristics. It is resilient, considered resilient to the climate change. And that's what they will be examining as we continue with this particular crop with Dr. Doug. And he mentioned another person that's involved with climate change at the university will be coming out when they can, this coming year, hopefully. We also are connected to a potato seed program. We started this 3 years ago with a couple of organizations, and the University of Manitoba was involved with those also. But we just had a few pounds that we were able to get, and then now we're up to a little more. And of course, we try them ourselves. But I think we harvested the crop, and then we have about 40 pounds of potatoes put away for this coming season. And hopefully, you know, with that 4th year coming up, I think we will have our own potato. And I don't have the information in front of me, but that's one of the things we're trying to do here in our own. And again, resilient. That's one of the characteristics we hope it'll have with this new seed that we're developing. We also have hope for a new greenhouse this year, a small one, and it's a start. We have a couple of programs involved with it besides our food bank, and hopefully that's going to happen with the necessary funding. And we also we started a small orchard, I guess it's continuing on this year again, but it's Saskatoon and raspberry. And again, it's natural vegetation that can grow in our area. So we had a couple of hundred plants planted, and it looked good by the end of the year. They were actually going very well. We had no loss actually on our plants. So it looks good for the coming year for that particular crop. We also grow our own tobacco. We were gifted with a seed tobacco about 4 years ago from someone traveling back from the States. And he gave us some tobacco, and we said we'd try it, and we did, and it grew well. And so now we have our own Peguis tobacco, and it's just for our own local needs, our own traditional purposes. And we do share it with the organizations that we have here, and sometimes there's ceremony here, so we share that with them also. So it's something that actually is, coming back from our traditional ways. Of course, we also have natural harvest. We have lots of berries, roots, medicines here that are harvested. And of course, meats. We have hunters that do hunt and share their crop. We are about 40 minutes from Lake Winnipeg, and so we do have fishermen also. So that is also part of the harvest. Just to mention climate change, it is evident. We've seen that, and we've seen it this winter. Actually, from early December till a week ago, our temperatures were less than minus 12 to 15 and warming up in the day. And that's something as my age I haven't seen before. So there is actually a change happening. We do have some extremes. Sometimes there's a late frost and it affected a crop 2 years ago in our stuff that we had planted early. So we were impacted by that for sure. And then there's early frost in the fall also that we have to watch. We did have some dry weather. I think I documented one day, maybe we had a little rain in May of this past year, 2020. And so we're lucky to have a little water system going that keep our plants alive, but that's another change we've noticed about having drier weather in the spring, weather-wise.
All
so
right,
we are looking at adapting to this, and
Thank you so much, Carl, for starting to get into some of those climate pieces to this discussion. And I wanted to just make sure that you'll be able to continue through the presentations and join us for the Q&A, because I did want to follow up on some of the great information that you shared throughout your presentation.
Yep, okay, thank you.
Okay, great. We'll get back to you in the Q&A. And now I would just want to turn it over to Lara Ellis, who is going to be presenting about ALUS's work. Take it away.
Hi, thanks so much for the invitation today. It was great to hear Susanna and Carl. I was looking at your pictures of people sharing food outside and thinking, won't it be nice when we can do that again in the summer, hopefully this summer. Anyway, I am Lara Ellis. I work for ALUS. We are, again, as Beth mentioned, it stands for Alternative Land Use Services. And Cameron, get ready because we're going to go fast because I've got a lot of slides and not a lot of time. So next slide, please. I love this quote. We're facing some existential crises, climate change, biodiversity loss, and we know that as well as all the things that Susanna mentioned about economic hardship, poverty, which are all related to food insecurity. If we're going to solve problems, we really need to start thinking differently. Next slide. So ALUS is an ecological goods and services, or payment for ecosystem services program. We support farmers to produce ecosystem services on their land. So these are services other than food. Next slide. I'm going to run really quickly through how ALUS works. All of this information can be found on our website, and I'm sure many people on this webinar are familiar with our organization. So ALUS, as I mentioned, we support farmers and ranchers to restore, conserve, and maintain natural features for the benefit of all Canadians and all citizens on planet Earth. Next slide. So we are a principle-based organization. We are truly grassroots. The program was developed by communities across Canada and delivered by farmers and ranchers. Next slide. We are a targeted program. Most of our projects to date are on marginal or sensitive land. These projects include things like grassland and wetland restoration and enhancement. We also do tree planting, and we're also doing more projects like delayed haying and getting into sustainable grazing. We're also market driven, and we are a completely voluntary program, so going above and beyond what is regulated for landowners. Next slide. We're an integrated program. We're not meant to be competitive with other environmental programs for farmers and ranchers. We are accountable. Our projects are independently monitored and verified by third party. And we are also science-based, and very happy that that's no longer, a forbidden word, but that's always been part of how we do business in terms of many different aspects of our work. So ALUS, of course, began in Manitoba. It was developed by farmers. All of our local committees are chaired by a farmer or a rancher, and our CEO, Brian Gilvasi, is a rancher in southwestern Ontario. Next slide. So as I mentioned, all of our community programs, we have 30 across Canada now, are led by a committee called a Partnership Advisory Committee, or a PAC. Each of these committees is made up of at least 50% farmers or ranchers. They administer the program, make financial decisions, and choose which projects will receive funding. Next slide. So not only is the administration of the program very community-led and grassroots, but the farmers themselves are very much involved in choosing which projects happen on their land, which is very important to make the best use of their land and their knowledge, their stewardship knowledge, to produce the most ecosystem services. Next slide. So you can see here, this is an example of some of the scope of the projects that we would do, where we have different sorts of project types on one particular farm. Next slide. So when we think about resiliency in our food systems and on farmland, because of land use patterns and past decisions, there's often a need to restore what's been lost. So many of our projects involve wetlands. They are critical, of course, to retain and filter water, which is more important than ever given the impact of climate change, where we're seeing more frequent and more severe weather systems and weather events, and also, we're having these seasonal yo-yos between flood and drought, and so we have to have some way of surface and stormwater management. Next slide. We also have many grassland projects. These projects are of increasing interest across the country because of their capacity to sequester carbon. They're also critical for pollinator and beneficial insect habitat. We've got a lot of partnerships with researchers that are quantifying just how much benefit there is to having areas of natural habitat on farms and ranches across the country. Next slide. So many of our projects also involve tree planting. We're very proud of the survival rate of seedlings with climate change and changing weather patterns. It's harder to have trees survive until they're free to grow. So, of course, trees are not only important for sequestering carbon and creating habitat, but they're also part of mitigating wind shear with weather events. Next slide. Riparian buffers. So these are, very important to protect water and keep nutrients out of waterways. But they're also an opportunity to create habitat, carbon sequestration, and also, keep soil on the field where it's of more use to the farmers than have it running away. Next slide. And in terms of resiliency, ALUS also contributes to local employment. We create good, interesting, and rewarding jobs for people in rural Canada. Next slide. And of course, we create secondary employment through the contractors that we use to install our projects, as well as the suppliers. Next slide. And of course, we are creating a new revenue stream for farmers and ranchers. Margins are getting tighter, as we all know, for farmers and ranchers. And so ALUS supports the installation of projects, and then annual payments are paid to the farmers and ranchers for maintaining those projects. Next slide. So we're very excited to see more governments and corporations stepping up and seeing that farmers and ranchers are a key part of climate change mitigation. Of note in particular is the new federal funds, the over $3 billion going to nature-based solutions. Next slide. And of course, climate adaptation, in my mind, more important than mitigation, of course, particularly when it comes to issues around water. Next slide. So we know that there are real financial benefits. There are financial benefits for the landowners themselves, but in particular for downstream communities in terms of water benefits. So, you know, there's a lot of talk about natural infrastructure, and that's part of this whole resiliency conversation, and a way, hopefully, that will bring more dollars to the table in terms of instigating new projects and scaling up programs like ALUS. Next slide. So, especially when we talk about water, sorry, all my friends in Prairie, Canada, this is a picture of Lake Erie, but of course the problems with nutrients are very key for Lake Winnipeg as well, and western water bodies. So, you know, we know that there are financial benefits to using natural infrastructure to resolve some of these issues rather than more built infrastructure, which is very costly and has, you know, an associated time frame. Next slide. So as Susanna was speaking, and Carl, resiliency is really multifaceted. So some of the benefits from the work that we do at ALUS definitely have are a key part of farm resiliency. So the habitat that we build for native pollinators and beneficial insects definitely relates to farm productivity. Next slide. Whereas some of the other outcomes aren't directly related, but are all part of our responsibility in terms of land stewardship and biodiversity protection. Next slide. So I think my 7 minutes are up, but if you can just run through, Cameron, there's 3 more, yeah, little pictures pop up here. So we, ALUS is very much built from the ground up. We welcome the involvement of everyone. So if you haven't been on a farm tour, if you don't know our organization, contact me, look at our website, but we really will only get better the more people that are involved. Next slide. And as the photos that Carl had, you know, we know that resiliency comes from working together at the community level. So we really do appreciate everyone's input and help in building resilient communities across Canada. Thanks.
All right, Lara, thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. I think the moderated discussion questions are really going to pertain to a lot of the things that you said, but I wanted to hand it over now to Alanna Gray from Keystone Ag Producers. Alanna?
Okay. Can you hear me okay, Beth?
Yes, we can hear you very clearly.
Okay, perfect. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for inviting me to this, Beth and Cameron. As Beth mentioned in the intro, my name is Alanna Gray. I'm a policy manager at Keystone Agricultural Producers, or CAP. Fun fact, actually, kind of to connect to Lara's presentation, CAP was involved in that initial ALUS project in the RM of Blanchard back in 2006. So it's really interesting to see it kind of come full circle here and have Lara and I on this panel today. Next slide, please. I went to go push enter there. Okay. So really quick, what I'm going to talk about today, a brief introduction to CAP, Keystone Ag Producers, and what we do. A very quick overview of primary production in Manitoba. I'm going to talk about the impact of climate change, and then, of course, talk about how we build resiliency. So next slide, please. So who is CAP? We are Manitoba's largest general farm policy organization. We represent the interests of farmers across the province. You'll see from this map here, we represent farmers all the way down in District number 4 down there in the RM of Piney, over to District 1, Pearson-Deloraine area, and all the way up to District 12. So that's Swan River up to the Paw. We also have 21 commodity associations that are our members. So this is groups like the Manitoba Chicken Producers, the Manitoba Pork Council, Manitoba Crop Alliance. They are our members, and commodity group members as well as district members are able to bring forward resolutions that then form CAP's policy. So I've put in here two of our values. One is that we're grassroots. Also really interesting to hear Lara's comments on grassroots. So of course our policy is developed from the ground up. It is based on input from farmers. And then we're also evidence-based. So all of our lobby and advocacy efforts are all going to be based on research that we do either internally or through collaboration with other groups. Next slide, please. So again, this is the briefest of snapshots of agriculture in Manitoba. The last census of agriculture was 2016, and at that point there was just under 15,000 census farms. The average age of farmers is 54. I'm going to kind of circle back to that at the end of my presentation. The top three agricultural commodities leaving Manitoba are canola, hogs, and wheat. And just a little bit of an idea of what was planted in 2020. About 3 million acres each of canola and spring wheat, and then about 1 million acres of soybeans. And also, of course, we have a very diverse and productive livestock industry in Manitoba as well. Okay, next slide. So I wanted to talk briefly, and Beth actually touched on this in her intro as well, the impact of climate change on agriculture in Manitoba. So we did some work with the Prairie Climate Center a few years ago on adaptation and mitigation for agriculture, to climate change for agriculture in Manitoba. And we used the Climate Atlas to do some projections of what could happen in Manitoba. And what we learned was that what it could happen is a longer growing season, which could provide opportunities for farmers in terms of different crops and different varieties of crops that they would be able to grow. But absolutely that longer growing season would be limited by what I have up on the screen here. So extreme and variable weather. So this is, again, what Lara was talking about with the floods and droughts and that yo-yo. And we've already seen that in my time at CAP. I've experienced the 2011 flood, the 2014 flood. And then more recently, if you look at the Canadian Drought Monitor, you'll see that there's evidence of moderate to severe droughts in a lot of areas in Manitoba. We're also going to see increased pest pressure. So for this, we're talking about insects, disease, and weeds. So some examples of insects that can really impact a crop. These would be things like flea beetles on canola, wheat midge, which obviously impacts the wheat crop. Disease, examples of disease on a wheat crop are going to look like ergot, fusarium. There's a soil-borne disease called clubroot that'll decimate yields in a canola crop. And also things like stem rust, which impacts an oat crop. Some examples of weeds in Manitoba, you're thinking about things like thistle and foxtail barley. And there's also been a new weed that we've found in a few RMs in Manitoba, and the government of Manitoba is monitoring quite closely. It's called tall water hemp. And there will be significant challenges if we can't find ways to control that weed moving forward. We're also going to see increased challenges with wildlife. So this is in terms of foxes, coyotes, wolves, bears going after or livestock. And you're also going to see pressures from waterfowl, so geese and ducks going after crops. And it does sound cliche, but farmers, honey producers are very challenged by black bears in certain areas of the province as well. We're also going to see drier summers with more days of extreme heat. Of course, significant stress on both crop and livestock producers. And then we'll see wetter winters, springs, and falls. So a wetter winter can lead to a wetter spring. And we know research has shown that if you're not seeding your crop, planting your crop within a time frame that works within the growing season, you will see a decrease in yields when it's time to harvest. And a good example of some of the problems with a wetter fall we saw in 2019, our members dubbed it the harvest from hell. Extreme wet conditions, a huge storm in October, and then really cold conditions through November. So farmers weren't able to actually get their crop off, and there was a lot of producers who were harvesting right before seeding in March and April, which is of course not an ideal situation. So next slide, please. So how are farmers currently building resiliency? So one way is through participation in environmental programming. The kind of flagship environmental program is the Environmental Farm Plan, or the EFP. Each province has their own EFP, but for the most part, it's national. Every province would have one. It's a voluntary self-assessment of agro-environmental risks that farmers undertake. So there's some education and awareness components to it, and then farmers do a risk assessment of their farm, and then create a plan on how to mitigate those risks. If you complete an EFP, you become eligible for suites of BMPs. So I've put here my second line is adoption of beneficial management practices, or BMPs. And I'm thinking here, you can think about a BMP in the broader sense, so just good practices that you can take. So that would be things like nutrient management practices. But you can also look at BMPs in terms of cost-shared BMPs, so program BMPs that you can access, government cost-shared programming, or also programming that's available through associations. And some of the things that Lara was talking about would be examples of on-farm BMPs. Farmers are also looking at different farm management practices. Regenerative agriculture is really picking up steam in Manitoba in the last few years. Conservation tillage practices, and then looking at different ways to grow cover crops and also intercropping. Farmers are also looking more into diversification. So I was thinking about this in terms of both, if you're a grain producer, incorporating some livestock into your operation, and then also diversification in terms of the types of crops that you are growing. So maybe growing some flax, some barley, or something like that, and getting that into your rotation. Next slide, please. So future resiliency, and this is not an exhaustive list at all, of course, but some of the things I was thinking about, technology is going to be critically important, and what I'm thinking about here is both things like precision agriculture, so the ability to input fertilizer right at the exact right spot that you need to through some of the equipment that you have on your farm. But I'm also thinking here things like soil science and research that really leads to agronomic advances. And another example I think is something like tile drainage or subsurface drainage. And plant breeding, I feel, would also fall under technology, but I wanted to highlight it as well. It's extremely important that farmers have access to varieties of crops that are going to be able to tolerate the stresses and pressures that climate change is going to bring. So for example, they're breeding midge tolerant wheat that's going to be helpful in being able to grow a wheat crop despite some of those pest pressures. Business risk management, this BRM, this is a significant file for most ag associations across the country. And I believe it'll bring some resiliency for farmers in terms of helping them manage the risks that they can take on their farm to adapt to climate change. So them having some protection when they are trying to plant a new crop, when they are looking at diversifying, being able to farm year after year and not having to be concerned about putting a crop in the ground come seeding. Weather forecasting, extremely important for farmers to have access to data so they can help make some good decisions. When to seed, when to spray, when to harvest, very important. Oh, I lost my list, there it is. An adaptable regulatory environment. I struggled here a little bit with the word adaptable. I had it as enhanced for a little while. What I'm thinking about here is a regulatory environment that enables farmers to do the work that they need to do, and they can adapt to some of the pressures that they are going to be facing and some of the changes that they are going to need to make in order to sustain as an industry. And support for young farmers as well. This one's near and dear to my heart, and CAP has done a lot of work on supporting young farmers. So this is going to come from industry, from government, and from the public as well, in terms of access to land, access to capital, encouragement to participate in the industry. I said I'd loop back to the comment about the average age of farmers being 54. There's going to be a significant shift in who is farming into the future, so we need to make sure that the next group of people who are going to be growing our food have the support that they need to manage the risks that are coming with climate change. So I don't know if I was 7 minutes there. I hope I did okay, Beth, but that's it for me for my presentation. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Elena. Right on time. And I'll just invite you to keep your camera on and ask Lara and Susanna also to do that. And Carl, we still have you on the phone here. So I wanted to first say there's going to be an opportunity to have speakers answer your questions. So for the audience, please add your questions into the Q&A panel of your GoToWebinar page. And I think we already have a question there that we'll get to right away. So just moving into this moderated discussion, I feel like, the first question I had was really about building climate resilience in food systems, but I think that through a lot of the presentations, you've already answered that in great ways. So Carl talked about how climate is changing in Peguis and how people are starting to respond to that. And then Lara and Alanna did a great job of sort of outlining some of those specific resilience building activities that farmers are doing and that ALUS is doing in the field. So I think that's great. So I thought we would move into a question about another shock, but it's sort of a different kind of shock. So it's the one that we're all currently experiencing right now with the pandemic. And I think that this, it very much highlights the need to build resilience more broadly to shocks. And there's been some significant implications to our food system in the past year because of the pandemic. So I wanted to turn it to the panel first to talk about how the pandemic has shifted some of your work building resilient food systems. And Carl and I had chatted briefly about this the other day, so I thought I would start with you, Carl. Are you still on the phone there?
Yes, I am.
Great. Yep. So I thought,
Mm-hmm.
did you want to talk a little bit about how, since the pandemic started, some of your community garden work has gone on, and maybe how that's helped people sort of get through this difficult time?
Yeah, late summer, we were okay in terms of having people work with us. And like we had there was 2 programs along with the health center that was involved. Like we have a food bank also, we have people there. They were also helping us. But as we got a little later in the summer, it was very difficult to actually, because the other programs were shutting down. We were kind of essential. I was glad that our leadership kind of let us continue on. There was mostly just 2 of us, my helper then. But yeah, it certainly affected everything. Like late fall, some of the harvest that we had to do. And very, very difficult to finish the year. And we do, like the people that have their own gardens, we'll clean them up and we go and till them late fall. One of the last things we couldn't this year, I think we did 3, for people, and that was it. So we're going to have all these gardens, these 56 people that work with us with their own gardens will be looking for some tilling this spring. So you can see that's how it affected us there, yeah, in terms of work.
Mm-hmm. That's great. And maybe just to go to Alanna next, I know you're representing a lot of farmers around the province. So how's your year been doing that kind of work, and how has the pandemic impacted your work building resiliency in food systems?
I thought a lot about this question, Beth. I would say, first of all, that crop producers have actually had a pretty good year. Farming is a fairly isolated profession, so there's not always a lot of interaction. I know when the pandemic first started, there was quite a bit of concern that they were going to have access to the supplies that they needed to be able to plant a crop. And I do think that one of the things that's happened through the pandemic for our organization is really highlighting that interconnectedness between everybody, which is kind of what we're talking about today with food systems and how we're all connected. One element of ag in Manitoba that has been impacted that I thought I could mention here is ag labor, and in particularly access to temporary foreign workers. So in Manitoba, it's only about 3% of our agro workforce that are temporary foreign workers. So it's not a huge percentage, but those workers for the operations that they are employed on are absolutely vital to making sure that the operation is successful. So for example, it's mostly vegetable growers and honey producers in Manitoba that rely on those workers to come here. Significant challenges, obviously, with the travel restrictions. But it really showed a lot of the collaborative effort between producers, the entire industry, and government in making sure that we could get those people here to work and make sure that we all had broccoli and onions on our plates come harvest time. So that was one thing I thought I could share with you guys today.
Yeah, I wonder, Lara, if you have anything to add in response to what others have said so far.
Yep. I think COVID has shown just how quickly we can adapt as humans when we have to. Our staff, we really moved to virtual meetings, as is everybody across the world. In terms of our program delivery, we've been really good. One of the things that we do worry about, though, is future financing. Of course, with a lot of we have, I think, close to 60 different funders. So there are going to be so many hardships, poverty, economic insecurity. So I think a lot of funders will be changing their direction for the next decade or so. Balance that with new investments from the federal government, though. So it's hard to know how that will shake out. But just showing that how, all the complexity of these systems, right? And how decisions are made. One thing that I always think about, though, just like the farm workers, bees were stopped at the border, I think, coming up from the Northwest US. So, as building that resiliency, with the projects that farmers across the country that Carl's doing are really important, right? We need to be as self-reliant as possible.
Thanks very much. And Susanna, from that sort of theoretical perspective, I mean, it's not a climate shock, but it's quite a shock that we've never experienced before. So how do you see these concepts interrelating from that sort of academic perspective?
Yeah, well, I guess briefly from the academic perspective, I think it's helpful to think about climate-related shocks in isolation, but actually the pandemic was like a bit of a trial run in terms of other types of shocks and ways that our systems could be impacted. And yeah, as I kind of mentioned in my presentation, I do think that has been a sort of silver lining. I hesitate to say that, as it is still so ongoing, and so many people have been so drastically affected. But we have learned a lot about what happens to our systems when there's a sudden and dramatic shock, and the way that reverberates through multiple systems. And then just to mention on the labor front, because my own work focuses on labor and agricultural systems, my research, and then also with Food Secure Canada, we do a lot of advocacy efforts and policy efforts. And for the way that it really shifted our work was suddenly a hyper focus on the people that are most vulnerable in this pandemic. And like you said, Alanna, like many farmers, while I'm sure some aspects of their operations became more difficult, once they were able to get labor, they were more or less able to continue operations. But there were a lot of efforts that had to happen to make sure that farm workers, once they came, were safe. And that didn't happen in a lot of situations. 3 farm workers in Ontario died of COVID-19, and they didn't have to. So it's really important to remember just the folks that are most urgently affected by some of these situations. And of course, COVID-19 was a really unique example, but I definitely think that in future crises, we should try to prevent those situations from coming about.
Absolutely. So I wonder, Cam, do we have any questions coming from the audience right now that you wanted to throw out there for a specific panelist?
Sure. Our first question from the audience is asking, how do we get governments to support smaller scale regenerative farming based on agroecological systems? So looking at that kind of smaller scale as opposed to kind of large factory farms. Maybe it might be most appropriate to throw this to Alanna, but I'm sure that Carl and Lara both have thoughts to give on how to support small scale farmers.
Oh, go ahead, Carl. You go ahead.
Oh, yeah, like for small scale, very challenging actually. And we are organic, by the way. All our vegetables are grown organically, so it does mean more labor intense when you do that, like in terms of weeds and but we don't mind it. It's something that I guess goes back in our heritage and culture. Everything growing naturally, and so that's it's an important thing with our elders, especially when they come around. So we share that about being organic with all the stuff that we have growing, and Dr. Doug here from the university too, and he bought this wheat to me, and I told him, I said, I'm hoping you're not going to ask me to spray it. I said, because I'd like to grow it organic, you know, this particular wheat that I have. And he said, oh, no, it's up to you. You're the grower. He said, go ahead, what you think. So that's what we're doing with this particular crop, this 3 acres of wheat, you know, so yeah. And as far as funding, it is a challenge, actually. It's very challenging because, you know, machinery is so expensive today, you know, and that's one of the things, you know, we find as we are broadening, you know, our operation here with more people. And so it's a big expense to keep up and find funding for the equipment that we do need. So it's an ongoing thing, and like decision making as being part of it, yeah.
Alanna, did you have a response to that as well?
I can comment on that. I'm just, as Carl was talking, that's a great response, and I'm just thinking of the things that the government can do. And I think there's a few roles that government can take in this regard. So one is, in particular to regenerative agriculture, it's that education and awareness. So I think there's 5 principles of regenerative. So letting everybody know what those principles are and how they can accommodate those on their operation. And then also I had some comments in my presentation about business risk management. So then providing some safeguards for farmers if they are going to try and go regenerative, to encourage them to do that and to encourage them to take some of those risks that are outside of, you know, the more conventional farming. So programming in terms of financial and business risk management is really important in that regard. And then the other piece, and government could have a role in this, but one thing that we've learned in agriculture is that farmers learn from other farmers. So you need to really highlight some of the good work that is already being done and have that neighbor to neighbor or peer to peer relationship, and letting everybody know at the coffee shop that they grew their crop this way and it worked really well, and here are some of the benefits. So having that discussion and having that kind of collaboration amongst farmers, I think, is really important there as well.
Mm-hmm. And Lara, I wonder if any of those points that Alanna or Carl making resonate with your work, or if you have maybe something that hasn't already been said about sort of policy recommendations to build resiliency.
Yeah, well, it's a timely question, right? The federal government just announced that new fund, and they don't know how they're going to spend the money yet. So everyone should write Alanna, because CAP, of course, does advocacy to government. But yeah, so write the Minister of Agriculture in Ottawa, or contact your local association and say exactly how you want them to spend the money. It's a 10-year program.
Can I say something about the funding part there too? Carl
yes.
here.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just want to go back kind of historically. We have a Treaty 1 signed in 1871. We surrendered millions of acres of very excellent farmland in Treaty 1 territory, and I'm sure most of you are aware of that territory, southern Manitoba. And there was promises made to our people. One of those promises were agricultural, that they would continue to keep us going in back to the land, use of our land. And, you know, over the years now, I look back, shortly after I got out of residential school, these programs started drying up. And eventually there's no funding coming from the federal government through our Treaty 1 promises. And so it's an ongoing battle with us. I look at it as almost systemic racism. I believe that some people have that within those departments, and it's always been a concern of mine. I actually even presented to the Commissioner of Manitoba for treaty, and never really got a good response. But yeah, it's an ongoing concern of mine, and as part of what I do here in Peguis, and I know the collaborative is very aware of what, you know, some of the arguments I've had with Agriculture Canada also, who, you know, because we cannot, historically we could not have a mortgage on our land or anything like that. So we were not, you know, we didn't get the funding that other people got. And so, you know, and that really sets us back. So it's a struggle. It's a struggle for us. And, you know, it's something that we have to continue to fight. Hopefully, you know, we can overcome that. And continue on with what we're trying to do here with food security.
Yeah, and Carl, I'm so glad you brought that up, and thinking it brings up some of the very clear policy recommendations that have come out of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and I think that it's something to think about. And I think it's especially poignant related to Susanna's presentation of that broader theoretical model that includes, the sort of social and ecological aspects of building resilient food systems, that social part that's so inherently tied to the sort of environmental dynamics that are happening as well. Yeah, so I think it's about that time to wrap up the session because we do have a few things to do at the end. And yeah, just before turning it back to Cameron to wrap things up, I just want to thank each of our speakers so much. Susanna, Carl, Lara, and Alanna, all of your insights and experiences are so helpful in thinking through some of these big issues that we're facing. So many uncertainties ahead of us with climate change, as we see in the Prairies chapter report. So many shocks that we're experiencing in our daily lives related to our food system because of the pandemic, and so many other challenges. Well, we see so many opportunities coming out of a lot of your work. So thank you so much. I'm going to now pass it back to Cameron Hunter for some final words.
Thanks, Beth. And again, thank you to all of our presenters today, Susanna, Carl, Laura, and Alanna. If we were unable to get to your questions today, please feel free to email me at chunter@iisd.ca, and we'll try to get you the information that you're looking for. I just want to let everyone know that we've recorded today's webinar, and we will be posting it along with the presentations to the PRAC website, prairiesrac.com. There will also be a short evaluation survey that will open up in a different browser tab as you close the webinar today. We would very much appreciate that you fill this evaluation out, as it helps to ensure that our future webinars and functions meet your needs. I would like to take one last opportunity just to encourage everyone to sign up for our next webinar in the series, which will be taking place on February 10th, and it will focus on engaging diverse voices in our adaptation planning processes. I think the conversation really started here, talking about food security and talking about the social dimensions that our food systems may pose, but that session will really dive more deeply into that topic. We're really looking forward to continuing the conversation. So thank you guys all so much for joining us today, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.
All right.